So a lot of drug spend is actually wasted. How do we essentially identify patients using AI?
Welcome to the Gain podcast. I have with me today Dr. P.Taylor-King, the co-founder of Relation. Dr. Jake, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Jake, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And you're the co-founder of Relation. Tell us what Relation is.
Okay, so let's do Relation first. So Relation is a drug discovery company. So, i.e., how do you go about industrializing the research process to, discover and create new drugs? And many companies are, in some sense, focused on designing molecules. And you may have heard this from DeepMind and AlphaFold and all of their excellent work on structural biology. We're really focused on the regulatory aspect. So what I mean by this is if you're designing structures, those structures have to do something, like they have to bind to a target protein. But that assumption, or you actually need to know what protein you're going after to begin with. So the process which we're focused on is how do you discover new biology, right? So if you think there's a lot of drugs out there, they all have different mechanisms. How do new mechanisms get discovered? So we're trying to massively scale up how we do that process. And so the business model is the discovery of novel mechanisms, creating molecules and antibodies against those mechanisms, and then bringing those assets into the clinic.
Yep, so you have a PhD in mathematics.
Yep.
How did Relation come about?
Okay, so Relation is a drug discovery company. So many drug discovery companies are really focused on designing molecules. Those molecules have to interfere with a certain biological mechanism. And the problem in that is that quite often you end up developing drugs for mechanisms that we already know about. So a lot of drugs work in very similar ways, right? What we're trying to do is build machine learning systems which are able to understand aspects of regulatory biology. And so therefore we can discover drugs that will act in fundamentally new ways. And so we want to kind of increase the library of mechanisms available, drug those, and then bring the resulting drug into the clinic. So run our own clinical trials. And so we brought together this amazing team which can not just build the technology, but can also interface with the clinic. So quite early on, we realized that what we're trying to do is fundamentally a very difficult thing. And we need to bring in serious talent who have run large-scale clinical projects before. So between the co-founders, we found our current CEO, a guy called David Roblin. He was the former ex-head of R&D at Pfizer and ran a team of about 7,000 people or something like that. And so, with our CSO, CTO, and a few others, what we're trying to do is just sort of industrialize this process of drug discovery.
It's amazing. I have to ask you, we're here at the Gain Summit. It's day 2. What has been your experience so far? What have you seen and what do you think?
It's been quite eye-opening in a way. I mean, in my sort of naive view, you kind of look at Saudi and you kind of think, I don't really know much about the kingdom.
Was it your first visit?
This is my first visit. And, I knew that there was this kind of strategic focus in becoming less dependent on oil. And I think, if you want to learn about exactly what is the latest cutting edge thing, which hasn't really been validated, this probably isn't the conference. But what I find particularly amazing is just the application, right? Which I don't think has really caught on in the same way in the West. I mean, I look, when I come around here and I look back in London, I think, oh, wow, actually there's quite a lot we can learn now from Saudi, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's great to hear, honestly. And you spoke at a session, correct, today?
Yes.
How was that?
It was fun.
It was good?
It was fun.
What are the topics?
It was on precision medicine.
Okay.
So there's a piece around why have we not had precision medicine yet. So one of the things you find is that as you start developing drugs, they're going to be efficacious in smaller and smaller populations, but we've got a lot of drugs on the market which have broad effect. It doesn't matter your genetic background, It doesn't. The efficacy is variable, of course, but we have a lot of drugs which we know work, across the population, and we see variable efficacies. And then one of the reasons for that is the kind of genetic background of the person in question. So a lot of drug spend is actually wasted. So I would say that maybe a third of people respond really well. A third of people maybe they have variable,
they respond differently.
Differently, and maybe there's a kind of baseline response. I think the future of medicine is not just about discovering new drugs. It's about working out who those drugs are going to be used for, and trying to build the appropriate care framework such that you can identify those patients, get the right drug to them. And so if you think about how the West has operated, we've been really focused on kind of fee-for-service models, i.e. you have a disorder, you present to the doctor goes, you look like just everyone else with this disorder, we're going to give you this drug, and it could be quite expensive. Maybe the drug doesn't work and you need more care, right? And so you're now paying for not just the drug, but the additional care. I think we can start thinking about more holistic approaches. So we can think about, okay, how do we essentially identify patients using AI? So who are these people? Look at people's medical records using large language models. We can think about how we risk stratify patients. Are you at low risk, medium risk, high risk? Work out who's actually going to respond to which drug, and then we can start thinking about developing the drugs not just for. Well, you can develop drugs for people who already have disease. So you need to break down drug development for both people who, well, really around the people who are underserved, right? So of that process, we have drugs.
Marginalized groups, would you say?
I wouldn't specify it as marginalized groups. I would see it as just based on your. If you could classify, let's take the case of like obesity and diabetes, like a problem which is really important to the kingdom. If you think, okay, maybe 40% of people could be pretty well treated by these GLP-1 treatments, so semaglutide, Wegovy, and the like. Maybe 20-30%, they're more advanced and they need insulin. But then maybe there's a missing 30%, which you're not sure what to do with, and so you might need new drugs for that portion of the population. So you want to understand, okay, how do I break up the population and get of the drugs that are available, give those to the correct group, but then in some cases there won't be a correct drug, and you need to develop those. And so I think that's really the opportunity in the space.
Okay, I understand now. I want to get a better idea of your work at Relation. How are you using machine learning to integrate genetics and is it genomics?
Yeah.
Genomics,
Okay. So I can break that. How much?
Or simplify
details?
it.
Yeah.
How much time do you have, Dema?
Okay. So genetics is more focused on DNA. Genomics is probably a slightly broader term. It would account for other nucleic acids like RNA. So I think the way that what we're trying to do is build, should we say, maps of how to go from health to disease and back again, should we say. Okay. So if you think about, you could conduct a study where you take a few thousand people who are healthy, a few thousand people who are diseased. You could study the differences in their genetics, and you could go, okay, well, maybe there's a certain amount of genes which will bring you from health to disease. Like you're more likely to have, diabetes. You're more likely to have bone weakness. We focus on osteoporosis, but those genes that are implicated don't necessarily. If you fix them, they won't necessarily make you healthy, right? Because there's a sort of predisposition, and these genetic differences have been present your whole life. So they take decades upon decades to turn a healthy human being into a diseased person. There is what is a drug? A drug is something which can sort of reverse that state quite quickly. So you want to go from disease back to health. And then finally, there's a question about tractability, like some drug targets work, others don't. So we use machine learning for all three of those problems. On the genetic side, you may have heard of ChatGPT. I think everyone has by now. These work by applying this kind of transformer architecture to words. What we do is we apply those kinds of architectures to letters, so DNA sequences.
Okay.
And so that allows you to interpret DNA sequences, because if you've got this string of, say, a million base pairs, it's just A, C, G, and T, right? Like, how do you turn that into something which is understandable or, has got any meaning to, the interested reader? So there's a piece around understanding genetic sequences. That's part one. There's a piece around reversibility. So how do you go from a disease state to a healthy state? We're really lucky in biology that we can actually reprogram human cells, right? So we can, there's this great invention or discovery around CRISPR you may have heard of. So this allows you to, if you imagine a cell as like a little computer, which has got this impossibly complex wiring diagram, you can use CRISPR to start cutting wires, right? Or reorganizing wires, or creating entirely new wires within that cell. And so if you understand that regulatory process, you can start trying to work out which levers do I pull to turn that disease system into a healthy system. And a lot of this, it's not just about the machine learning, it's about the interface of the machine learning system and the lab, right? So these are all experiments you're doing every single day. And the results of those experiments you want to feed into a machine learning system, but then you can use reinforcement learning or active learning to come up with new questions to ask.
Okay.
So then the machine learning directs your experiments, and then you have this sort of loop, and we call it lab in the loop.
Lab in the loop.
Lab in the loop, yeah. And then finally, you've got a bunch of things which look very interesting therapeutically, and you can't take forward 10 drugs at a time. We'd love to, but it would be horrifically expensive, and our investors would lose all their money. So we have to prioritize. You can only really bring maybe a handful of things into the clinic, if that. So you've got to be very targeted, and we use machine learning to kind of synthesize evidence.
Yeah.
So you've got all of these different lines of evidence around some target that you're interested in. Maybe one of them is particularly druggable, maybe one of them's got a bigger effect size, maybe one of them might cause side effects if you were to do it. So you need to synthesize evidence and choose, okay, this is the drug target I want to progress.
Within your sector and what you're doing in relations, why did you choose to continuously work within osteoporosis?
Yeah, great question. Essentially, we've had this revolution in modern biology, which is really been driven by single cell profiling of different tissues, right? So what is this technology? It's the ability to look at the nucleic acids, so DNA, RNA, one cell at a time. So when you have, let's just say, a disease which, let's just say it manifests in the blood, or it manifests as a tumor, right? These tissues are kind of,
is it like leukemia?
for lack of a better word, they're kind of squishy, or they're in liquid, right? So you can extract these cells one at a time. Now, for many disorders, we actually don't have very good data sets or a very good understanding what the tissue is made of, because the tissue is intrinsically much tougher, right? Like, so cartilage, bone, brain to some extent. And what we've really been working on is how to, at an industrial scale, I should say, study bone at single cell resolution. So you may not realize this, but your bone is not a static organ. You more or less recycle 10% of your bone every year. So it gets broken down and it gets rebuilt. And we've known that there have been cells inside bone for decades now, but this has all been from imaging studies. So you slice up a bit of bone, you start putting in some dyes and you see, okay, look, there's a cell which is embedded within the bone. What we've been able to do more recently is start really smashing bone apart and extracting these cells and trying to study them using some of these single cell profiling technologies. And this has kind of given us a completely new way of looking at bone. Like it's never before seen detail. And so one of the big things I spend my time on is I run our clinical study. And so we get discarded bone waste from about 13 hospitals which carry out orthopedic surgeries. So we get these chunks of bone, we break it up, and
you just study it.
yeah. Well, we've got a number of different techniques we use.
Okay, well, it works perfectly well. I want to ask you about machine learning. It's becoming more prominent in healthcare. What are some key challenges that you're seeing within machine learning in healthcare?
I think it's about finding and building the right team with that kind of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary expertise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or who are, should we say, sufficiently open-minded that they're willing to try new things. So we have, a lot of people now being trained in data science, being trained in machine learning, engineering. We've got a lot of people being trained in molecular biology, single cell technologies. A lot of the future that I envision is going to be really driven by people who can not just know one discipline, but can sort of talk to teams, talk across teams,
Mm-hmm.
and educate to the right level their colleagues and help build those networks. I'd say, this is always a challenge. We've done it pretty well now, but it's one of those things where the job is never complete.
How can we use AI to develop treatments or even improve personalized medicine?
Sure thing. So I think when we think of personalized medicine, we should first think about the patient care pathway, right? So there is this process by which you are ill and then hopefully in a short period of time, you are healthy again, right?
Okay.
So first of all, there's a piece around identifying patients. And for many disorders, you just go to the doctor and you say, hey, look, I have an upset stomach, I have a headache, whatever it is. You are brought into the clinical system. For many disorders, that's not the case, right? So osteoporosis, you don't feel that you have weak bones until you fracture. So it's a symptomless disease. I think there's a lot of opportunities to use AI to essentially identify patients. So maybe you've had a scan for whatever reason, and maybe if you have the right algorithm and you've got the right data modality, you could pick up, should we say, telltale signs that actually you could be osteoporotic, and maybe you have a follow-up scan. So I think there's identification. I think there's a piece around risk scoring, like how susceptible for bone. This is easy, right? Like how thick is the bone? For many diseases, we don't have good measures of what is healthy, what is disease. You see this all the time with we think we know what's going on with Alzheimer's, but we don't really, right? So many drugs have failed. And then there's a piece around working out who should have the drug, because some people won't respond to drugs. Like there's a really interesting case in osteoporosis where an academic friend of mine, he did this really interesting work where he found that there was this genetic signature which essentially meant about 17% of the population would lose bone mass when they're on one of the key approved therapies called teriparatide. And so it's really quite shocking, because suddenly you're paying not just for the drug, but for essentially...
You're paying it for physically.
Yeah, well, the additional surgery you'll undoubtedly need. And then there's the drug development piece, right, which is if you know that there's 3 drugs on the market for a certain disease, maybe those 3 drugs address 60% of the population, but there's still another 40% who those drugs won't work for. So you need to discover new drugs to address that 40%. And so I think this kind of end-to-end view, there's opportunities for AI at all stages, right? So I was talking about how our platform works on drug discovery. I think there's a lot of work to be done around understanding that link between which patient needs which drug. So one is much more of a discovery, basic science, translational research problem. Another one is much more of a scaling problem, which is we don't have genetic data on everyone. How do you collect it? How do you store it? How do you work out which genetic marks are likely to drive drug response?
And I imagine ethics is a big part of it. How do you operate ethically when it comes to collecting, DNA and genetic data?
Yeah, so all of our studies are REC HRA approved through the UK IRAS system. But obviously, depending on the country in question, depending on the geography, you've got different research and ethics requirements. We more or less the way you do this is you have secure compute environments. You try to restrict access to only company employees. You try to everything is stored behind a VPN, etc.
There's policies put in place to kind of ensure that. Okay.
Exactly. Eventually, though, my hope is that we will release some of this data, because actually, the way, obviously anonymized, but one of the things which is really important to us is that as we carry out genomics and genetics research, like the benefits of this research make themselves back into the wider scientific community.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, the way you're speaking, you're very passionate about relation, and it seems like a lot of the work that you're doing is about inclusivity, making sure that you're including that population that we're talking about that might be missed. Yeah, so it's really wonderful what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to ask you, in terms of the business side, so you co-founded Relation, it's a tech bio company, but can you share some of the challenges that you faced in building the company that sits at the crossroads between technology and biology? Are there any challenges along the way when you're creating this company or co-creating it?
Where to start? Yeah, good question. I think so. A few things kind of come to mind. One is that doing what we do, genomics. So we have three major drivers of cost in my mind, and they're all completely crucial to the business. Not just, and this is just beyond people. So I'm not even talking about HR here. I'm talking about. So one is we do a lot of sequencing. And sequencing, we've got our own sequencer in-house. We can do a lot of functional genomics. All of this is very, very expensive. We validate targets. So you start building hypotheses, and you want to understand the mechanism. And again, you need quite a big team, which is flexible to investigate different aspects of that piece of biological mechanism. And then also we've got the compute, which is you're building big foundation models in some cases. Like the compute necessary is just huge. And so to some extent, we've been very lucky in that NVIDIA have invested in us, and that brings with it access to some of the infrastructure we need. But the point is that the kind of entry point to get going is quite challenging. And so, when you're a small company, you're kind of having to show the greatest possible evidence with the smallest budget, and then eventually you're able to raise more, and you can start building your own lab out and this kind of thing. So it's less of a problem now, but when you're first starting the company, it's always challenging working with third parties. A big piece for us is owning the data generation process, because the problem with a lot of biology is temperamental. And even if you and I were to go into the lab and do, quote, the same experiment, maybe we hold our pipettes slightly differently. I went off and made myself a coffee in the kitchen. You just kept going with the experiment. You're way more diligent than I am, and my experiment gives slightly different results to yours. And so because of that, there are these challenges. So with working with third parties, so you want to control the data generation process, and ideally you want to automate, which is another big part of what we're doing. That's part one. I think there's another part which is quite specific to the industry, which is you've got different types of investors, and different types of investors value you on different things. You have platform investors or tech investors who are really focused on what does the technology do, and then you might have biotech investors who they don't really care about the technology. They just want to see the drug, and so those two will kind of think about your company in completely different ways, and you have to structure yourself properly.
You're just sitting in the middle of it.
Exactly. You want to be the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you want to make everyone happy.
Exactly.
At the end of the day. I don't know if I should ask this, and they're probably going to cut this out of the podcast, but I'm so curious because you work in this sector. What did you think of, is it Theranos? Yeah, what did you think of that? Just your perspective of it, any side of it. I would love to hear your side.
Yeah, I think I mean...
Could it have been possible?
Could it have been possible?
Yeah, is my question.
I think there were academics which were kind of pointing out the holes in it.
Early on.
It was a blind spot of the industry. So I think when you have some of these tech investors, they like this idea that, hey, look, you can go find like a 19-year-old and they're going to completely change how medicine is done. And
it's catchy.
Yeah, it is catchy. It's idealistic. I've not seen many cases where that's been true. Like, I think, tech is one of those areas where you can make $1 billion company with comparatively much less investment, in the tens of millions maybe. I think biotech is different in the sense of there is some very niche expertise you probably need. Yeah. You need way more money. And kind of
what
big,
you're telling me, I got an idea of that.
Yeah, and it's I think it should have been flagged earlier that this was not going to happen. I mean, I'm not sure how much you know about it, and I certainly don't know everything.
I read the book. I read a little bit of the book.
Yeah.
And I had a better idea, but I think early on there were many issues, but I think marketing and PR really came in and just
100%
covered everything and made it look like a wonderful dream. And like you said, a 19-year-old, we all want to look to her and be like, yes, the youth is the future.
Maybe she wasn't 19, but
I think she was young. She was still a sophomore year of university, I think. But I mean, the idea of it, the concept of it, a prick of a finger to detect disease, is that possible? Do you see that being possible in the future using AI?
Not using AI. It'll be if it were possible, which I'm not sure it is, and I'm not the right person to comment. It would be, some kind of nanotechnology at some level. It would. I couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about these. A few of the questions are a bit repetitive, but relation is focused on diseases with significant unmet needs. How do you see AI helping to accelerate the discovery of treatments to these conditions?
I think what's interesting about biology is that we're all products of evolution, and the thing about evolution is it's kind of inefficient in many ways. So much of biology and much of the genes in your body are kind of like weird copies of each other, right? So you've got many proteins which kind of look similar, and they carry out maybe similar but different functions. Maybe you've got completely different proteins which carry out the same function. So biology is this kind of giant copying machine, but it's very difficult for humans to see what those patterns are, right? Like at a high level, phenotypically, we can see some of these, right? So one of the cells which I love is a cell called an osteoblast, and what it does is it lays down bone, right? So it's part of this bone recycling process I was talking about. There's actually other cells, like chondroblasts, which lay down cartilage, right? So there's actually a lot of similarity between these two cell types. Cartilage is not bone, but there is a similar process happening. There's also lots of types of cytotoxic cells that will eat up, some pathogen or virus or tumor cell, in your body. So T cells, natural killer cells, macrophages, they all carry out a sort of cytotoxic response. So one of the great opportunities in this space is collecting enough of the right data such that we can reuse data across lots of different disease areas, right? So when we develop a drug or when we carry out a program, you end up spending millions of dollars generating the data you need. But wouldn't it be amazing if you didn't have to start from zero at every time? Maybe you could use a foundation model which gets you, should we say, 70% of the way there, and now you only need to carry out 30% of the data generation that you did before. So the hope is that this is going to be able to scale, and then once you build the correct data set, you've built the correct modeling architecture, you've got something that works over and over again.
Can I ask you, what's next for Relation?
I think there's really two things. One, I think there's three parts to this answer. On one hand, you can think about developing the pipeline, i.e. those targets that we've started designing assets for, bring those assets into clinical trials. So you want to show safety, you want to show efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. There's a piece around automation, and I think, for AI to really work in biology, we need to transform the lab as well. We can't just transform the computational workflows. It has to be two-sided, right? And then I think finally, it's not just developing drugs, but also thinking about how you partner biomarkers with those drugs, right? So like, if there was 100 people in front of me, and I know that my drug's only going to work 30% of the time, 50% of the time, how do I identify those people without having to just give the drug to everyone and then see what works?
What are you looking forward to the most for Gain Summit? We have one more day left tomorrow. Is there something specifically you're looking forward to seeing, or any sessions or talks?
Yeah, I've always been really interested in how, I guess it's sort of somewhat of an AI thing, but it's more about healthcare and sequencing, which is a lot of the Middle East have been very progressive in building large genetic databases and biobanks around their citizens. So they have a much better understanding of, should we say, the genetic diversity of their population versus the West in many ways, actually. So, I think some of the bigger data sets in the UK are probably heading for maybe, 500,000, maybe 1 million, 2 million people. I think those sizes have already been reached, if not are in the process of being reached in the Middle East, which is really impressive. And I think these kinds of data sets are going to transform how we do drug discovery at R&D. And so I'm just really intrigued by the vision, impressed with the results. And anyone who's going to talk about that, I'm all ears.
The future sounds bright.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what that sounds like.
Definitely.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Jake, for your time and your insights. I learned a lot, so much, genuinely. Like we said.
I'm not sure I structured it very well.
No, but you did. You did. I'm the same way, by the way. I like looping in and out of conversations. So it was perfect. Thank you so much. This has been the Gain Podcast with Jake Taylor-King, the co-founder of Relation. Thank you so much, Jake, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Cheers.
You.